Again, people that say that Priest without Tipton isn't Priest are probably the same people that said, Priest without Halford isn't Priest. Now, those people actually can't explain some of the best Priest songs like Cathedral Spires and Death Row, which were made by the band during Halford's absence. Next rant. Ripper. A good vocalist, but not for Priest. Being a Priest clone doesn't actually mean that you should be in Judas Priest. What does that even mean? Would Priest be better off with some guy that sings like Barry White? If you're described as a Halford clone, that basically means that you're a really good singer. So that's a compliment to any singer. And if you ask me, Ripper actually isn't a Halford clone. If you listen to the live stuff, you can actually hear some tributes to Halford here and there, but that's just normal. After all, you're singing Priest songs. But he actually has his own way of singing stuff. I guess to a certain extent you could call him a clone, as he sounds very similar to Rob in some of these parts, and he uses some of the same vocal techniques. But Ripper's, vocal DNA actually differs from project to project. If you listen to some of his songs that he recorded after he left Priest, you would never think that, that's Rob Halford singing those songs. You can clearly hear that it's Ripper. On top of the fact that his vocals are distinguishable from Rob's, they also differ in visuals. Ripper kind of has that working man vibe, like he's restoring old Harley somewhere around Akron, Ohio. He doesn't have tattoos on the side of his head. Ripper doesn't perform live like in a full-on leather-studded jacket like Halford does. Chances are that you're gonna see him, wearing jeans and, having a shirt or maybe like a leather jacket on top of the shirt, and that's about it. Even in Priest, if you check out the Live in London DVD, he isn't wearing like leather gloves and, leather chaps. He does have a glammed out jacket, but that's just for like the first song. And for the rest of the show, he just looks like the Ripper. The only thing that I would actually describe as, Ripper's trademark is his baseball cap, which oftentimes changes, and sometimes it's one of those like Monster Energy sponsored caps or something like that. So I think it's basically unfair to just call him a Halford clone. Because if you want Halford clones, you can actually find at least a handful of other famous singers that look or actually sound more like Halford. Or at least they're trying to sound more like Halford. Moving on. There is a popular channel in metal circles. That channel published a review of this latest Judas Priest album, and the reviewer said that when Halford left the band, that Priest hired metal everyman Tim Ripper Owens. Well, if you look at, Ripper's career from this perspective, from 2018, and look at, all of the things that he's done during the years since he left Priest, I guess you could call him a metal everyman. He became one of those metal hired guns, and that's a perfectly legitimate way to run your career. But when he joined Priest, as far as stardom goes, he was basically nobody. He wasn't a metal everyman. He was just a guy who sang his ass off for like 10 years, sold office supplies, and then, he got that chance to become great. And he used it. He worked his ass off for like the last 20 years, so kudos to Ripper. The reviewer also said something else which kinda bothered me, and I quote, "Jugulator and Demolition, which despite having a couple of bangers, were not very well received and have not aged very well." What the fuck does that even mean? Not being well received? I think it's really unfair to pin the reception part on Ripper. The thing is that Halford left and he was out of the equation. The band actually put out their greatest album ever, and when I say that, I mean it's not easy to follow that album, like what's gonna be the follow-up to that album? Are you gonna make another Painkiller? I kinda doubt it. After Painkiller, even if they put out like an amazing album, it would still fade in comparison to Painkiller, because Painkiller is that good. And yeah, Judas Priest lost some fans along the way, but that also wasn't kinda Ripper's fault. And I think it's really unfair to just say, the albums weren't received very well, and then just like move on like nothing happened. Juggulator came out in the mid-90s. You know that period when grunge hit and basically decimated the metal fans that were visiting the shows? That same era where kids were still mourning, you know, the death of Kurt Cobain. You know that time prior to MP3s when record companies were doing really great and they were dictating what's gonna sell and what's not gonna sell. You know that time where if you weren't grunge, you basically couldn't get a record deal, and if you already had a record deal, the record company actually wouldn't back you unless you do a grungy album. That period when the record companies would actually shelve bands that had, you know, big successful record deals, and they just wouldn't publish any of their music. They wouldn't back them. You know that time when everybody who was and wasn't metal basically cut their hair. You know that time when even AOR musicians, you know, that adult-oriented rock, when guys like Michael Bolton changed their image, you know, cut their hair and ditched that rock element of their AOR music. So they would actually like fire the guitar player or basically make him play with less distortion, and they would, you know, bump up the keyboards more in the mix. So I think it's really unfair to correlate, you know, the fact that metal was in the dumps anyway and that Ripper joined Priest. To be fair, if anything, Ripper was one of the guys that helped put metal back on the map. And now for that, not aged very well. I mean, what does that even mean? It is true that they don't perform songs from that album live, but they could perform these songs, and actually fans want to hear them. People that listen to Iron Maiden actually bitched about Blaze songs as well. But then Bruce came back in the band and they started performing these songs, you know, The Klansman, Sign of the Cross, and Lord of the Flies. If Maiden didn't perform these songs live, I'm guessing that these same people would say that those songs didn't age well. But considering they did play them live and they made, you know, the DVDs, the Rock and Rio DVD, Death on the Road DVD, now they aged well. So if Priest actually played these songs live, I'm guessing that these same people would say, oh, these songs aged very well. So I think that's also very unfair. And to tell you the truth, if Halford just started singing one-on-one, for example, on one of these concerts, I mean, people would mosh, people would really dig that music because it's a good song.